Uh, Sat Sri Akal, Assalamu Alaikum, Khush Amdeed, Istiqbal, Ji Aaya Nu, Adab। ਮਾਝਾ ਹਾਊਸ ਦੇ ਇਸ ਬਹੁਤ ਖੂਬਸੂਰਤ ਵਿਹੜੇ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਅੱਜ ਦੀ ਇਹ ਮੁਬਾਰਕ ਸ਼ਾਮ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਮੁਬਾਰਕ। ਮਾਝਾ ਹਾਊਸ ਦਾ ਇੱਕ ਖੂਬਸੂਰਤ ਇਨੀਸ਼ੀਏਟਿਵ ਕਲਚਰਲ ਲਿਟਰੇਚਰ ਆਰਟ ਨੂੰ ਅੱਗੇ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਆਉਣਾ, ਪ੍ਰਫੁੱਲਤ ਕਰਨਾ, ਸਾਰੀ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਤੱਕ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਪਹੁੰਚਾਉਣਾ, ਇਹ ਮਾਝਾ ਹਾਊਸ ਪਿਛਲੇ 3 ਸਾਲਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਬਹੁਤ ਖੂਬਸੂਰਤੀ ਨਾਲ ਨਿਭਾ ਰਿਹਾ। ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸਾਰੇ ਜਾਣਦੇ ਹੋ ਮਈ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਾਂਝਾ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦਾ ਇੱਕ ਬਹੁਤ ਹੀ ਨਵੇਕਲਾ ਚੈਪਟਰ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕੀਤਾ, ਜਿਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਮਕਸਦ ਦੋਹਾਂ ਮੁਲਕਾਂ, ਦੋਹਾਂ ਪੰਜਾਬਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿਚਕਾਰ ਇੱਕ ਖੂਬਸੂਰਤ ਮੁਹੱਬਤ ਦੀ ਸਾਂਝ ਦਾ ਪੈਗਾਮ, ਇੱਕ ਉਹ ਪੈਗਾਮ ਜਿਹਦੀ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇੱਕ ਅਰਸੇ ਤੋਂ ਸ਼ਦੀਦ ਲੋੜ, ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਸਾਡੀਆਂ ਸਾਂਝਾਂ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਤੋਂ ਸਾਂਝੀਆਂ ਸਨ, ਇਕੱਠੀਆਂ ਸਨ, ਕਿਸੇ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਕੇ ਪਿੱਛੇ ਹਟੀਆਂ, ਤਾਂ ਇਹ ਇੱਕ ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼ ਮਾਝਾ ਹਾਊਸ ਦੇ ਇਸ ਚੈਪਟਰ ਥੱਲੇ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਦੋਵੇਂ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਚੜ੍ਹਦਾ ਤੇ ਲਹਿੰਦਾ ਫੇਰ ਇਕੱਠਾ ਕਰ ਸਕੀਏ। ਅੱਜ ਸਵੇਰੇ ਮੇਰੇ ਇੱਕ ਬੜੇ ਅਜ਼ੀਜ਼ ਦੋਸਤ ਨੇ ਕਾਸਿਮ ਜਾਫਰੀ ਲਾਹੌਰ ਤੋਂ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਬੜੀ ਖੂਬਸੂਰਤ ਇੱਕ ਗੱਲ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਉੱਠਦਿਆਂ ਭੇਜੀ ਅਰਲੀ ਮਾਰਨਿੰਗ ਕਿ ਜੁੜਨਾ ਜੇ ਤੇ ਪਿਆਰ ਦਾ ਧਾਗਾ ਹਾਜ਼ਰ ਹੈ, ਜੁੜਨਾ ਜੇ ਤੇ ਪਿਆਰ ਦਾ ਧਾਗਾ ਹਾਜ਼ਰ ਹੈ, ਆਉਣਾ ਹੈ ਤਾਂ ਦਿਲ ਦਾ ਵਾਗਾ ਹਾਜ਼ਰ ਹੈ। ਸੋ ਬੜੀ ਖੂਬਸੂਰਤ ਗੱਲ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਦੋਵੇਂ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਰਲ ਇਕੱਠੇ ਹੋਣ। ਤੇ ਫਿਰ ਮੇਰੇ ਕੋਲੋਂ ਰਿਹਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਗਿਆ ਤੇ ਮੈਂ 4 ਲਾਈਨਾਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਸਵੇਰੇ ਹੀ ਲਿਖ ਕੇ ਭੇਜੀਆਂ, ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਦਿਲ ਦੀ ਗਹਿਰਾਈ ਤੋਂ ਸਨ ਕਿ ਤੈਨੂੰ ਦਿਲ ਦੀ ਹੂਕ ਸੁਣਾਵਾਂ, ਤੈਨੂੰ ਦਿਲ ਦੀ ਹੂਕ ਸੁਣਾਵਾਂ, ਬਾਰਡਰ ਵਾਗੇ ਸਭ ਟੱਪ ਆਵਾਂ, ਪਿਆਰ ਤੇਰੇ ਦਾ ਧਾਗਾ ਫੜ ਕੇ, ਮਜ਼ਬੂਤੀ ਦੇਖੋ ਧਾਗੇ ਦੀ, ਪਿਆਰ ਤੇਰੇ ਦਾ ਧਾਗਾ ਫੜ ਕੇ ਇੱਕ ਵੱਡੀ ਲੰਬੀ ਪੀਂਗ ਝੁਟਾਵਾਂ, ਔਂਸੀਆਂ ਪਾਉਂਦੀਆਂ ਥੱਕ ਗਈਆਂ ਉਂਗਲਾਂ, ਮੁੱਕੇ ਹਿਜਰ ਤੇ ਵਸਲ ਮਨਾਵਾਂ, ਤੈਨੂੰ ਦਿਲ ਦੀ ਹੂਕ ਸੁਣਾਵਾਂ। ਇਹ ਸਾਂਝੇ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦਾ ਇੱਕ ਬੜਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਸ਼ੁਕਰੀਆ, ਸਾਂਝੇ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦਾ ਇੱਕ ਉਪਰਾਲਾ, ਇੱਕ ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਚੜ੍ਹਦਾ ਤੇ ਲਹਿੰਦਾ ਫੇਰ ਇਕੱਠਾ ਕਰ ਸਕੀਏ। ਐਂਡ ਟੁਡੇ ਵੀ ਆਰ ਰੀਅਲੀ ਆਨਰਡ ਟੂ ਹੈਵ ਦੋ ਬੜੀਆਂ ਮਾਇਨਾਜ਼ ਹਸਤੀਆਂ ਸਾਡੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਮੌਜੂਦ ਨੇ, ਫਕੀਰ ਇਜਾਜ਼ੁਦੀਨ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਔਰ ਨਵਤੇਜ ਸਰਨਾ ਜੀ। ਇਹਨਾਂ ਬਾਰੇ ਮੈਂ ਹੋਰ ਕੁਝ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਹਾਂਗਾ, ਮੈਂ ਸਿਰਫ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਹੀ ਕਹਾਂਗਾ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਮੇਰੇ ਦਿਲ ਦੇ ਦੋਵੇਂ ਬਹੁਤ ਕਰੀਬ ਨੇ, ਦੋਵਾਂ ਪੰਜਾਬਾਂ ਦੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਕਰੀਬ ਨੇ, ਸਾਡੀ ਸਕਾਫਤ ਦੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਨੇੜੇ ਨੇ, ਸਾਡੀ ਰਹਿਤਲ ਬਹਿਤਲ ਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਸਾਡੇ ਤੋਂ ਬਿਹਤਰ ਸਮਝਦੇ ਨੇ। ਔਰ ਅੱਜ ਇਸ ਲੜੀ ਨੂੰ, ਇਸ ਗਲਵਕੜੀ ਨੂੰ, ਇਸ ਜੱਫੀ ਨੂੰ, ਇਸ ਪਿਆਰ ਦੀ ਇਸ ਸ਼ਾਮ ਨੂੰ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਤੱਕ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਆਉਣਗੇ ਰਵੀ ਜੀ। ਰਵੀ ਜੀ ਇਜ਼ ਇਨਟੂ ਪਬਲਿਸ਼ਿੰਗ, ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਵੱਡਾ ਇੱਕ ਪਬਲਿਸ਼ਿੰਗ ਹਾਊਸ ਹੈ ਔਰ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਦੀਆਂ ਬਿਹਤਰੀਨ ਕਿਤਾਬਾਂ ਇਹ ਲੱਭ ਕੇ ਆਥਰਸ ਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਤੱਕ ਪਹੁੰਚਾਉਂਦੇ ਨੇ। ਔਰ ਵੀ ਆਰ ਬਲੈਸਡ ਟੂ ਹੈਵ ਸਚ ਸੋਲਸ ਅਰਾਊਂਡ ਅਸ ਐਂਡ ਹੀ ਇਜ਼ ਅ ਇੰਟੈਗਰਲ ਪਾਰਟ ਆਫ ਮਾਝਾ ਹਾਊਸ। ਐਂਡ ਨਾਓ ਰਵੀ ਜੀ, I hand it over to you to introduce our guest speakers and what you are going to take us today in this beautiful and wonderful and divine evening. So over to Ravi ji.
Thank you, Arvinder. This is, as Arvinder said, part of the Sanja Punjab initiative of Maja House. Sanja Punjab, which is, to my mind, a wonderful platform to explore and discuss the shared histories and cultures of Punjab. Really, we couldn't have had 2 finer people representing this culture than we have today, Fakir Ijazuddin and Navtej Sarna. And they, when I say they represent the best elements of this shared heritage, is because of their breadth of knowledge, and of course being rooted in the culture of Punjab, but also being very universal in their outlook. So the breadth of their knowledge, the variety of their interests, their intellect, their scholarship, and above all, I think their humanism. The discussion this evening is focused on Ejaz Sahib's book, The Resourceful Fakirs. And through that, it will also look at the history of Punjab in the time of Ranjit Singh, the court of Ranjit Singh, and Punjabi culture and history. The book, which has been reissued now, it was first published in 2013. It's just been reissued. We've had the honor of reissuing it. It tells the story of the Sikh Empire at its height, at a time when it was one of the most progressive and powerful kingdoms in the world, in the time of Ranjit Singh, and it tells the story through the careers of the three brothers, Fakir brothers, who were Ejaz Sahib's ancestors. Fakir Azizuddin, Fakir Inamuddin, and Fakir Nuruddin. And that's really, and it's an unusual way to look at the life and time of Ranjit Singh. It's been done before, but this really brings a unique perspective. And as I said, at that time, it was, among the most powerful and progressive. To me personally, it is a progressive element which matters more, because it was quite remarkable at that time for its cosmopolitanism, for the diversity and multiplicity that it encouraged in society and in culture. And that is what that is why this book, for me personally, is fascinating. Ejaz Sahib, Fakir Ejazuddin, he has several books to his credit. Books on Lahore, books on the Lahore Museum, on Pahari paintings and Sikh paintings in the Lahore Museum. He has also written a brilliant autobiography. I don't know, you should at some point think of, abridging it, reissuing it. It really is quite an extraordinary story. And I hope that you will think of republishing it, reissuing it at some time. And he has had a very distinguished career in the corporate world. He was also briefly, I think it was in 2007, 2008, he was a minister in the Punjab government in Pakistan. In conversation with him today is Navtej Sarna, a widely acclaimed and very distinctive author whom I personally have had the privilege of working with and publishing. And I've also had the privilege of his friendship. And I hope that I will soon publish him again. He's among his books, most relevant to the discussion that we'll be having today is this remarkable novel called The Exile, which is based on the life of Maharaja Duleep Singh. And apart from that, his first novel, which is when I first met him, when he was writing that, it's We Want Lovers Like That, a very moving novel. And he has also done fantastic translations of several books, including the Zafarnama, Guru Gobind Singh Zafarnama. And he has translated his father's stories. And he's working on a novel which I'm reading right now, and I'm looking forward very much to that being published. So Navtej, over to you. Navtej, if you could now, you discuss the book and the aspects associated with it, with Ejaz Sahib. Navtej.
Thank you very much, Ravi. Great pleasure being here, and thanks to Maharaja House for this opportunity to talk to somebody who I've admired for many years, Fakir Ejazuddin Saab. We've met, we've discussed things. We were together at a conference at the Library of Congress, the ill-fated Capitol building, which saw such an attack recently in happier times. And other places. It's a great pleasure. And I must admit that I have come to this book of yours a bit late, but I'm so glad that I have come to it. It is a phenomenal book. And I really wish I had read it before because it takes care of so many gaps in the Ranjit Singh story and in such authoritative detail that I would recommend it strongly to anybody who wants to look at this period. There's a lot being written, there's a lot written, and but this is true and beautifully told history. So this book has been a pleasure, and I look forward to our conversation. I want to lead you gently into it and not really, I want to save some of the nice questions for the real middle. But I first want to, just give a paragraph's quote from your book, which really sets the stage for instance, the painting that you're sitting in front of. That is really Ranjit Singh's Lahore for us. I can see the Naulakha Pavilion, I can see the Hazuri Bagh, I can see his Samadhi, I can see all those places which occur in the life of Ranjit Singh. So just a word about him first, and I'm not going to speak myself, I'm going to quote your book to give our listeners the feel of the book. It says, by 1838, Maharaja Ranjit Singh had been the undisputed ruler of the Punjab for more than a quarter of a century. He governed an area larger than the United Kingdom. He had been acknowledged a Raja of the Punjab before Queen Victoria was born. He was already a Maharaja when she was crowned queen. Unlike hers, though, his kingdom depended on the strength of his willpower, the force of his formidable intellect and his health. Half blind and semi literate, he had over the years developed a phenomenal memory. He remembered everything, he forgot nothing. Whether it was on which horse's saddlery he expected to find some prized arms, or which clause mattered in which treaty he had executed with his counterparts, or how many troops his enemies had. Ranjit Singh's greatest quality, in addition to his valor and intelligence unclouded by education, what a lovely phrase, unclouded by education, was his talent in selecting people. And this is why I wanted to read this paragraph. The talent in selecting people. He had around him a court of exceptional ministers whom he knew could do what he himself may not be, being semi-literate, may not have had all the capacity to do. Everybody needs ministers. And amongst his ministers were the three Fakir brothers, Imamuddin, Azizuddin, and Nuruddin Saab. And I would like you to tell us, firstly, from a very personal point of view, your family connection, how you must have lived with the thought, the memory of these people in your blood, so to speak, and then how you have decided to tell their story, and then we'll come to each one of them.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and I'm deeply grateful to Manja House and also to Ravi for having the courage to reissue this book. It came out, as Ravi has mentioned, some years ago, and I was privileged that I was able to present a copy of this Navtej to Khushwant Singh Ji. And I saw him a fortnight before he passed away, and he gave me 15 minutes of the last fortnight of his life, which was very precious for me. And I was told that it was the last book that he had read, because when people came to condole after his death, it was lying next to his, remember he used to have this favorite sofa, and next to it was a small table upon which he kept his reading material. And this book was lying there. So it has a very special connection, not just with the Sikh community, but through Khushwant Singh Ji, whose works were of seminal importance to me. But, and it is through his works, his life of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, and of course, the history of the Sikhs, that I was introduced to these brothers. I knew them as a kind of triumvirate, not necessarily as individuals, as a triumvirate. And this relationship with them deepened to my father when he wrote his family memoir called The Real Ranjit Singh, which incidentally is being reprinted by Hay House. So for us, we grew up in this tradition of familiarity with the three brothers. Much of it was episodic, and much of it was anecdotal. And I felt that it was important for there to be a corrected, if you like, a corrective biography of them. And I began researching through the archives, Punjab archives, through all the books that I had on that period of Sikh history, and was able to put together, using this material, also material that was abroad, to write this particular biography. The association of, it's a heavy inheritance to carry, knowing that your forebears were persons of such critical significance and of such, how can I put, diplomatic, who had such diplomatic finesse. It was not easy for three brothers, three of them, not one, not two, but three of them, to be living in the Sikh court, of which some aspects were inimical to them as persons, and yet to be able to enjoy the confidence of the Maharaja, who was, as you've just pointed out, an extremely canny individual, but to be able to retain their loyalty, not just in that generation of the Maharaja, but then the next generation as such. And it goes into the third generation as well, when it comes to Nonehal Singh and elliptically, the Deep Singh. So I felt that it was important for there to be a reassessment of their contribution to a period of Sikh history, which was unique. I call it unique because it was the first time in 5,000 years of Punjabiyat that there was a Punjabi kingdom. Never before and never afterwards. But for that glorious period between 1792 and 1849, give or take the debacle in the last few years, but during that period, the Punjab came into its own. I'd like to believe that it fulfilled the destiny that history had etched for it. And I felt that if one can convey what were the strands, the different strands, Hindu, Dogra, Sikh, Muslim, and Christian through the Frangis, how they were all woven together in this skein, which held, and going back to what Ravinder had just mentioned earlier, वो ਜਿਹੜੀ डोर ਹੈਗੀ ਸੀ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਇੱਕ ਡੋਰ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਬੰਨ ਕੇ and ਪੁਖਤਾ ਕੀਤਾ. That is a remarkable achievement. And that really was the genesis of the book. So it was to honor the contribution of my ancestors, and then also, in a sense, to bring it slightly up to date, because if you read the epilogue, it does bring the story up to the end, to me, to the modern Lahore.
That's a very touching epilogue that you have there, not just with you, but even the descendants of Alad visiting and the other Farangis who used to work at his court. His descendants have been coming to Lahore, and you have been generously giving them of your time and guiding them to places of memory. But before I come to the tapestry, as you said, this dori, of course, it's known as the Sikh kingdom, but it's truly a Punjab kingdom.
Yes, indeed.
And, because all the religions and everything, and we come to that, but each one of these people, each one of these, the Sardars, the Dogras, the Muslim brothers had their own particular contribution. And I think the trick of the three ancestors of yours, if I may say so, lay in the use of the word fakir. Because I think, I've heard of a saying says that there is nothing like too rich or too thin. But I think they probably believe that there's nothing like too poor. Because Azizuddin had coined this family motto, Fakir al-Fakir.
That's right.
Proud to be a fakir. So why did they were truly not poor. So why did they wear this mantle, literally and metaphorically, of a fakir, this coarse brown robes, against these glittering Dogras and Sardars?
Well, there are two strands of thought. One in the family is that, of course, Maharaja Ranjit Singh offered them this title, and he asked them whether they want to be a Raja, do you want to be a Nawab, a Diwan? And Fakir Azizuddin is supposed to have said in reply that we would like a title which, if we're rich, it should teach us humility, but if we're poor, it should describe our condition. The more prosaic reason, though, is, as I discovered in my research, that in fact there was a Fakir, Al-Qadri Sahib, who was a mentor of Fakir Azizuddin's grandfather, and so Ghulam Shah. And it was really as a tribute to him that they decided to adopt this title. It wasn't a suit of armor that they wore. to protect themselves from what would obviously be criticism, as we'll discover in a few minutes, criticism about their private wealth compared to their outward modesty. They were very canny. They realized that there was no purpose in being flamboyant in a court in which there was flamboyance available, everywhere. It was visible everywhere. So their best protection was to be modest, but to be efficient and to be articulate. And that really was the secret of Azizuddin's proximity and closeness to Maharaja Ranjit Singh.
So Azizuddin was actually the consummate diplomat. He was the man with the way of words. And I don't know if you have a piece ready with me. His language has to be heard. And also after that, can you tell us about, what were the roles played by the other two? Because in some ways they were sequential. It started with Imamuddin, then Azizuddin, then Nuruddin in prominence. So but we must hear some of that lovely language of Azizuddin.
Well, in the modern age and to modern ears, this may seem rather euphuistic, highfalutin, overblown, but nevertheless, one has to remember that there were two reasons for this. Number one, that was a style rather like in the French, in the 17th century, 18th century, and even the 16th century. Because French was the official language of diplomacy, there tended to be a floridness in official communications. And this continued here because the documents that were exchanged between the British and the Afghans and the court were all in Persian. But let me read one, which is, albeit a translation, but it gives you an idea of what flowed from Azizuddin's mind. And this is a letter from Maharaja Ranjit Singh, obviously drafted by Azizuddin, to the address of Her Majesty's Minister for the Affairs in India. At a happy moment, when the balmy zephyrs of spring were blowing from the garden of friendship and wafting to my senses the grateful perfume of its flowers, Your Excellency's epistle, every letter of which is a newborn blown rose on the branch of regard, and every word a blossoming fruit on the tree of esteem, was delivered to me by Mr. Burns and Mr. John Leckie, who were appointed to convey it to me. Now, you notice the way it starts at this wonderful, flow cornucopia of words, and it comes down to Mr. Burns and to Mr. Leckie. But what I would like to share with you, Navtej, is, apropos to this, Burns had come, as you know, with 4 dray horses. Now, these were used in London for drawing beer barrels, okay? And because these beer barrels were heavy, they had to be strong, sturdy horses. So these 4, plus the 4 mares and a stallion, were sent to Maharaja Ranjit Singh. He, of course, was expecting something like Arabian stallions, which were nimble and fast, and instead he got these plodding cart horses. And this is the reply that Maharaja Ranjit Singh sends, but obviously, again, drafted by Azizuddin. And it said, Maharaja Ranjit Singh praised the horses which, in beauty, stature, and disposition, surpass the horses of every city and every country in the world. On beholding their shoes, the new moon turned pale with envy and nearly disappeared from the sky. Such horses, the eye of the sun had never beheld in its course throughout the universe. Unable to bestow upon them in writing the praises they merit, I'm compelled to throw away the reins of the neck of the sound steed of description and relinquish the pursuit. All this for dray horses, right? So this is the kind of eloquence that Maharaja Ranjit Singh relied upon Azizuddin to provide.
Well, you mentioned a very dear part of Ranjit Singh's heart, which was horses.
Indeed.
And, I think this must have been loaded with sarcasm when Azizuddin wrote this, because Ranjit Singh was a man who, had the world's best horses and wanted more and more. what were his other passions?
Well, of course, there are a number of stories associated with his amours, etc. And there's no doubt that he was an extremely virile man. And this was aided in a pre-Viagra day with potions that were concocted by Azizuddin, amongst other apothecaries. I think it's fair to say, and I hope it comes through in the book, that Maharaja Ranjit Singh was more than the kind of indiscriminate person that is sometimes made out, and certainly by Western biographers. I'll mention two incidents which I think are significant and which I came across in my researches. The first is when he meets Lord Bentinck. Mm. And this is the first time that a Governor General has actually called on him. And although Bentinck did not come across, except at the Sutlej, across the river at Ropar, he didn't come to Lahore, for example, but nevertheless, there was an acceptance of equality by the British as far as Ranjit Singh was concerned. And that elevated Ranjit Singh to a different stature in the eyes of both of the British and, of course, his own community. But the incident I mention is when Ranjit Singh hears that Lord Bentinck assists Lady Bentinck into the boat as they cross the Sutlej. And when he hears this, in a way, his heart melts, and he says that is exactly how I felt towards Moran, his Muslim wife. That's exactly how I felt towards her. And wherever she is, and wherever I am, we are constantly in communion. Now, for a man, with the harem and whatever, but for him to reveal this kind of sensitivity and affection for a person who obviously was as close to him as she was more than just a lover, she was a friend. And that is what he was trying to convey. That is one. And another incident is after Bentinck leaves, dare I say, a prostitute comes to him and says that parks herself outside the tent. So he calls her in and he said, what's the problem? Because she refused to go away. And she produces this fair child. And he says that, she says that this belonged to, she was sired by an Englishman. And I think his name was Birch. And Maharaja Ranjit Singh looks at her and says, yes, it's clear that she is of mixed parentage. And then he looks after them and insists that they remain in the camp, beyond his tent, obviously, until they are taken to the British camp. Now, this is the kind of sensitivity. He could as easily have dismissed it and said, I've got nothing to do with this. She was not his subject. Yeah. But the very fact, it was almost like Mary Magdalene being restored, as it were, such. And the third incident was General Ventura refuses to marry a woman that he'd been living with. And she goes and complains to Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And he calls Ventura and he says, you can't do this. This is not right. And then reprimands him and suggests that he does legitimize this relationship. So what I'm trying to say is that he had a number of interests, obviously, but his interests, apart from the material ones of gold and jewels and horses, as you've just, but there were these human relationships, and they mattered to him, and they mattered right up to the end when you have the touching scene where Azizuddin and the Khan Singh, etc., are in attendance and watching the Maharaja gradually slip away, and how they take pains to try and remind him of their loyalty to him.
That's right. That's right. And you mentioned Mora, and and it comes out from your book that obviously from his 18 or so acknowledged Ranis, if I remember the figure right, and about the concubines not being counted, she was really in many ways the love of his heart, and he had braved a lot because she was a courtesan from the streets of Lahore, and he used to go out as the young Maharaja and pick her up, take her on a favorite horse, Laili, and ride out. And then he was punished. He was he was to be whipped at the Akal Takht.
Yes.
And he submitted to that, and took off his shirt and stood waiting for the lash. And they just touched him and let him go. But that was the humility of the man. And of course, the third passion you mentioned, his dying moment, was for gems.
Yep.
And the Kohinoor, and how he was willing to give it at the moment of death to the Jagannath temple. And tell us about that moment.
Well, you know the story of the Kohinoor. Everybody is familiar with it. And again, there are variations. And I was fortunate that I was able to get some authentic accounts of the acquisition of the Kohinoor from Shah Shuja, and then the description that was left by Wafa Begum, Shah Shuja's widow, given the description that she gave to Fakir Nuruddin, because after the annexation of the Punjab, Fakir Nuruddin Sahib was asked to record the history of it. So he went to Wafa Begum, and she described how, when it came to the value of the Kohinoor, she used this wonderful description where she said that when Nuruddin asked her, what do you assess the value to be? She said, if you were to take 5 stones and throw one north, east, west, and south as far as you can throw them, and then throw the 5th stone as high in the air as possible and fill the entire space with gold, it would still be less than the value of the Kohinoor.
Oh my God.
Now, obviously, it was a very desirable stone. It had a historical significance. And who would not have gone to the measure, gone to the extent that Maharaja Ranjit Singh did to acquire it? Look what the British did to be able to acquire it. Sorry?
They still have it.
Well, this is interesting, Nathej, because, William Dalrymple has written the book on it, and Anita Anand has helped him with part of it. When they came and launched the book in Lahore at the Literary Festival, I asked them, I said the original was 186 carats, I think, 176 or 86 carats. And it was reduced to 106. We know where the 106 is because we're still squabbling over the ownership of it. What happened to the other 80 carats? And there's a reply amused me because they said, we hadn't thought of it. I said, but that was as much part of the historic Kohinoor as the residual 106 carats. So this is something that, in a more modern context.
I must say that I was lucky I didn't have to face your questions, because I was the 3rd author on that contract.
Oh.
I was supposed to contribute a section of the book on that, and then I had to resign from that because I was appointed as High Commissioner to London. And I couldn't have very well been sitting in London and writing about the truth about the Kohinoor.
Indeed. Wonderful.
So I left it to the 2 of them, and I'm glad they faced your probing questions. But to go back to the Fakir brothers, Azizuddin Sahib, of course, was this consummate diplomat, but Imamuddin, who was in prominence in the early years, spent his life actually as the Kiladar of Govindgarh fort, which contained, his, Maharaja's treasury, and was also a sort of a prison. So he was a very trusted man with the wealth of the Maharaja. Would you say that?
Yes, indeed. Just to complete the biographical sketch you've been kind enough to summarize, interestingly, Imamuddin was the first person in the family to be used by Maharaja Ranjit Singh, apart from Ghulam Muhyiddin, who was asked to come and lance a boil or something because he was a hakim. But out of the 3 brothers, he was the first to be given any diplomatic responsibility, and he goes across in 1812 and meets Metcalfe. But for some reason, Maharaja Ranjit Singh recognizes that the elder brother, Azizuddin, who is not mentioned in the official dispatches, is the more competent of them. And then after that, Imamuddin kind of slips away he moves off center stage. And as you say, he was then given the Kalidar position at Govindgarh Fort. And that is where all the armory the manufacture of arms and weapons and cannons and cannonballs was maintained. It was a position of immense trust. And there were occasions, I've mentioned them in the book, and I think you wanted me to talk about this.
One instance.
Two occasions upon which his fidelity and his integrity were questioned.
That's right.
One was during Maharaja Ranjit Singh's time, when Maharaja Ranjit Singh, obviously informed by a number of other people, who everybody was informing on everybody else, he taxes Azizuddin. And he says that I understand that there's been defalcation at Govindgarh. And Azizuddin replies, he doesn't deny it, but he says that if it can be proven, if it is proven, then I'm prepared to pay 3 times the amount that is alleged to have been stolen. And Maharaja Ranjit Singh says nothing. And as I mentioned in the book, it's because he realized that perhaps they were more valuable to him in their service than they were through the minor amount that had been misappropriated. The second time is when, after the death of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, Nonihal Singh, who was quite the modern MBA, he wanted things straightened out, etc. He wanted the things at the court to be regularized. He then asks for an audit to be done of Govindgarh. And the audit is conducted, and they do find an element of misappropriation. But it is not clear whether there was any action taken, certainly not, from what I can see, because Fakir Tajuddin, his son, then succeeds him and continues as the Kiledar at Govindgarh Fort. So obviously, they felt that their experience, their knowledge, and also their integrity was sufficient to be relied upon. So Mahmuddin more or less spent the whole of his career then as the Kiledar at Govindgarh Fort. But it was then, there was an overlap, if you like, that the youngest brother, Fakir Nuruddin, my lineal ancestor, comes into the fore as a Mehmandar. And he's the one who then is responsible for arranging the reception of foreign guests, foreign visitors like Jacquemont, like Baron Hugel, James Wolfe, John Wolfe, etc. So they are the ones, he's responsible for that function of maintaining Lahore. And then finally, the sad, doleful responsibility of building Maharaja Ranjit Singh Samadhi following his death between 1839 until it was completed in 1849.
Well, from the way you describe the functions, it brings back to me the sort of foreign service lingo. And, I would, if Fakir Azizuddin was the ambassador, then Fakir Imamuddin was the sort of head of chancery. And
yes.
Fakir Nuruddin was the chief of protocol.
Yes,
because,
fair.
You describe in your book tremendous visits, like, Auckland's visits and other visits of the envoys, Wade's visits, Burns was earlier, but the latter visits, Jack Moore's visit. Fakir Nuruddin Sahib used to make these very elaborate arrangements. Can you give us some idea of those arrangements? It's amazing the kind of chickens and eggs and stuff that you write about.
Yes, indeed. I found, I'm glad you caught that, that particular reference. We read so much about the, how can I put it, the vanilla coating of court life. But it's interesting to come across documents which go slightly, subsurface. And in this case, I found in the correspondence a letter from Fakir Shadin, who is Azizuddin's son, and who's been given the responsibility of arranging the commissariat, if you like, for Lord Auckland's 20,000 troops who are coming. And it was fascinating because, let me just read out the passage to you. It said that Fakir Shadin wrote to say that the English demanded 600 camels and 100 carts for the carriage of loads, because traditionally the host was responsible for all the logistical arrangements for the guests, regardless of whether it was an army or whether it was just one person like Baron Hugel. The letter from Shardin also mentioned that 500 grinding stones were required for grinding flour, that Captain Wade desired that and mark this, that the widows from villages and talukas may be asked to come over and grind flour. The widows were regarded as being unemployed and therefore were free to come and grind the flour. Widows, it would appear, were easier to obtain than wheat. Procurement of sufficient wheat for such a large force remained a recurring problem. Shardin gave an idea of the quantities involved in his letter. At the time of the entry of the Sahibs, Shardin wrote, and Shah Shujal Mulk into Firozpur, the following quantities would be required. Fowls, 100,000. Wheat, 20,000 mons. Gram, 60,000 mons. Moot, dal, 5,000. Grinding stones, 3,000. Milk, 1,500 mons. Broken marsh dal, 3,000 mons. And fuel, 40,000 mons. Daily, the British camp needed 15,000 eggs and 4,000 chickens. And it didn't matter which came first.
Beautiful, beautiful. I think that just brings out the kind of, hospitality, if you like, that Ranjit Singh used to lay out for the visitors, and which brings me actually to the visitors. I mean, a lot of your book is sourced on visitor accounts and some not so easily available visitors accounts which you have got. Are these good as basic sources, and also what are the sources which, I mean, you have had the privilege of using from the Anarkali libraries, but which unfortunately are closed to people like me at the moment. What are the sources that we are still missing on the Sikh kingdom?
It's a very valid point you've made, Navtej. Partly because you and I both write in English, and so therefore there is an inherent constraint in this because there's a limitation. But the reason I relied upon these particular visitors was that their accounts, whether authentic or not, and Smythe, of course, is the archetypal inventor of unreliable stories, etc., in his reigning family of Lahore. But putting him to one side, most of the others wrote fairly factual accounts of their visits. And so to that extent, I regarded them as reliable first-hand accounts of what they saw and the kind of people that they met. So, but the second was to take the documents which were available, as you say, in the Punjab archives, and these were letters that were written or reports that were written from Lahore, whether it was through official channels or through the Daily Akhbar, which was kind of a secret report that went, use those to flesh out the story. The third source, which unfortunately I have not been able to access, and very few people have, on both sides of the border, are those Khalsa records, which were in Persian. There are bundles of them in the archives, as there are in, for example, the Khalsa Library in Amritsar and a number of others. Those records have not yet been tapped nor translated. And I'm sure that and many of them date back to 1809, which is the beginning of Maharaja Ranjit Singh's reign. So I'm sure there's a lot of information embedded in them, which could be revealed, provided there is somebody who could read and translate Persian reliably, because that's the most important thing. Until that is done, we're dependent upon second-hand sources like Suri's translation of Umdat al-Tarikh, etc. It's very detailed, but not necessarily entirely reliable. The reason I used him was there was a kind of a technique that he'd used of describing the emotions or the attitude or the reactions of Maharaja Ranjit Singh or the courtiers, etc. So I thought that brought out the flavor of the time. And that was the only reason I relied upon Suri. But otherwise, I'd dearly like to be able to research the Persian archives of that period. And most of the records would have been maintained in Persian, not in English.
Well, I hope that somebody takes up this project of cataloging these and having them translated, whether it's done in Amritsar or Lahore and made available to everybody who's interested. But you're right that most of the visitors wrote very detailed accounts, and particularly I think Emily Eden, she seemed to have a fondness for Fakir Azizuddin also. When he visited Simla, I think there's a very interesting quotation which I had pulled out, who describes him as, he is dressed outwardly as a fakir ought to be, in coarse brown cloth, but if that opens a little, there is underneath a gold dress embroidered in seed pearls. And then she goes on to say, we all ought to have Azizuddins of our own if we wish to be really comfortable. So this speaks to how much comfort he gave to everybody who met him. But she did try to set him up with a similar widow, didn't she?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, had she, then you would have had half an Englishman sitting here talking to you about Sikh history. So,
and why didn't
yes,
work
she tried.
Why didn't it work out?
Azizuddin was too staid for that. For one thing, he had, for example, at Shimla, that particular visit, the Lord Auckland arranges with Emily Eden and her sister Fanny that there should be a ball. But many of the women, English women, refused to dance in front of the Sikh sardars because they said we'd be mistaken for nautch girls. Azizuddin was one of the few who actually had seen dancing take place. It had been, he'd met Lady Bentinck and so he was quite au fait with this. But there's wonderful description where he and the other sardars are watching the dancing. And it says that they sat like pictures on a wall. I thought it was lovely. Pictures on a wall. They were absolutely impassive, not moving, but not particular. I think he was too much of a prude. And also he realized that there was no question of him coming back from Shimla with a name, because for one thing, Maharaja Ranjit Singh it would not been possible. And second is the allegation that she was a spy planted on him. That's the obvious allegation. And I think he was too astute for that. Yes.
So to go back to the man himself who wove this all together, Ranjit Singh, and since we mentioned earlier that he had all the different religions sort of represented at his court. Of course, that was, he was supposed to, he used to say that, God gave me one eye so that I would see all religions with equally. That was a good remark to make. But were there any rivalries? I'm sure there were, for instance, the three Fakir brothers and the three Dogra brothers who also held huge influence, or the Sandawalias who also were related to the Maharaja. So surely these people were, backbiting, bitching about each other, cutting out each other. I mean, normal stuff.
Yeah, but you're a diplomat, you'd know this better than I do. What is interesting to me is the fact that you did have these three groupings of, a trinity. You had Ajit Singh Sindhwalia, Lena Singh Sindhwalia, and the others, one group. Then you had the three Dogra brothers, Gulab Singh, Dhyan Singh, and then Suchet Singh. And then you had the three Fakir brothers. But oddly enough, they never overlapped, not overtly anyway. And while there must have been a lot of behind the scenes backbiting, etc., and undercutting, but you never get this impression that they were hostile to each other. Certainly the Sindhwalias, obviously, when they're given the opportunity, they then kill Maharaja Sher Singh, but that was more to reinforce their own claims to the Gaddi. But interestingly, I could find no evidence of these three groups, in fact, overlapping each other's responsibility. None of them is asking for an assignment, wanting something that was given to the brothers, or arguing about why Gulab Singh was got Jammu, and what happened to Suchet Singh's assets when he transferred them to British India. He transferred them to Firozpur. He sent his family there. So these kind of things, I'm not aware of any kind of conflict, abrasion between these three groups as such. They tended to be, and the Fakir brothers particularly, they tend to remain, apne had mein rehte the. They remained within their own boundaries.
But I think probably it was, the old man's sort of gimlet eye which held it all together. Because the minute he went, they were all, hacking each other to bits and throwing the bodies into ditches and hanging them from the trees and, parading their heads. The empire just collapsed like a rotten apple. So, and so did the Fakir brothers then gradually lose their influence and got sidelined?
Well, yeah, you've given a rather a bloodthirsty account of the last years. Yes, they were. It's sad to say that the thread that bound the whole court together, which was the Maharaja's personality, the moment that unraveled, then of course the fissures began to appear and they fell apart. Of the three brothers, Fakir Azizuddin died in 1842, 45. And he, in a sense, for the last 3-4 years of his life, certainly post Maharaja Ranjit Singh's death, he had begun to withdraw from the court, partly because the nature of the court had changed. Khadak Singh was there, Naunihal Singh, and there is this particular incident where Naunihal Singh challenges Azizuddin. And he's this young, brash, heir apparent, MBA, yes. And he then challenges Fakir Azizuddin. And I'll just read out this, I think it's here, where, there's Naunihal Singh. It's a very telling incident. Yeah. It's this one, and the setting is that Maharaja Ranjit Singh has died, Maharaja Khadak Singh is on power, and Naunihal Singh is waiting for the opportunity to take over. But he is trying to manage, rather like Jared Kushner, I suspect, trying to manage things from behind the scenes. Okay? And and I mentioned here, on one reported occasion, Naunihal Singh's insolence got the better of him. And here is the quote: "The Kanwar observed to the Fakir in an angry tone that he always explained the letters of the British government to the Maharaja in such a manner that he acquiesced in them without a word." Now, this was a challenge, saying that you were stage managing the Maharaja. Azizuddin retorted with as much dignity as he could muster that, and I quote, he had been employed for the last 30 years in improving the friendship between the two states, and that in any case, no one dared to advise the Maharaja in any case. Now, here is this man who obviously was the mouthpiece of the Maharaja and also part of his thought process. And when he's challenged by this young cub, he says, listen, I've spent my life doing this, what you want to unravel, but also remember that nobody, if you're a Maharaja, nobody can persuade you to make up your, to decide on something that you do not want to decide. So this is where Azizuddin then realizes that he's fined by the Khalsa. Obviously, he couldn't pay he wasn't going to pay the fine. They needed the money, so they fined all of the major courtiers. And then he just retires and disappears into oblivion. Imamuddin died. He was 1847, a couple of years later. He was ailing, and then he comes to Lahore and then dies here. Nuruddin, interestingly, is then he becomes post 1846, after the war, he becomes a member of the Regency Council for Maharaja Dalip Singh, and then accompanies Maharaja Dalip Singh to, partly to in exile, and also he escorts Maharani Jinda when she is exiled from the Punjab, and he takes her from Sheikhupura fort to Meerut, and then comes back from Meerut, and she continues with his son, Fakir Kamruddin, who then goes on to Banaras.
And
So the next generation, sorry?
And Zahuruddin continued with Dalip Singh and was one of the witnesses at the conversion of Maharaja Dalip Singh in Fatehgarh.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
So you see, the next generation.
Indeed, it continues. And what is interesting about Kamruddin is that Kamruddin is a young boy. And here you asked me a question about which sources do you rely upon? And I analyzed, I described them. One source was family recollection. And I went to an aunt who was actually the granddaughter of Fakir Kamruddin. And she was in her 80s by then. So I said, do you remember anything about this? About your Nana as he was? And she said, ha. Can I speak in Punjabi now? So,
yes, please, yep.
please. Ha, oh, sanu, sardiyan de din san, yo sanu choge vich, ek paase menu bitha dena, ek paase mere ਭਰਾ ਨੂੰ Fakir Mukhizzuddin, who was the custodian of, later became the custodian of the Fakir Khana. And ਫਿਰ ਚੋਗਾ ਸਾਡੇ ird gird ਫੈਲਾ ਕੇ ਤੇ ਉਹ ਫਿਰ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਕਹਾਣੀਆਂ ਸੁਣਾਉਂਦੇ ਸਨ ਮਹਾਰਾਣੀ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਤੇ ਹਥਨੀਆਂ ਤੇ ਉਹ ਜਦ ਗਏ ਸਨ ਤੇ ਇਸ ਰਫਤਾਰ ਵਿੱਚ ਗਏ ਨੇ ਅੰਗਰੇਜ਼ਾਂ ਨੇ ਇਸ ਰਫਤਾਰ ਤੇ ਉਹ ਕਾਫਲਾ ਲਿੱਤਾ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਹਥਨੀਆਂ ਅੰਨੀਆਂ ਹੋ ਗਈਆਂ ਸਨ ਮਿੱਟੀ ਨਾਲ ਅੱਛਾ. So then I said, anything else that he mentioned? And she said, how pyar naal onu dholu bulande san. Fakir Kamruddin. Now, this became of critical significance because when Maharani Jinda was externed from the Punjab, and she was taken by this man called Ensign Cox to Banaras, every day, somebody had to go into the tent to confirm that she was there. And the only person that she trusted was Fakir Kamruddin. And when I read Cox's reports, daily reports of that journey, he begins by saying that Fakir Kamruddin, whom the Maharani calls Dolu as a pet name, all right, is with us. And I send him in every day to confirm that she's present. And in fact, then right at the end, Fakir Kamruddin is required to go through her jewelry, her jewel boxes, to find out whether any items that belong to the Darbar as opposed to her personal jewelry. And he feigns illness for 2 days and pretends that but they finally get hold of him and force him to witness this. And then he does so and then immediately returns to Lahore with whatever few objects there were.
Ajasa, we're going to wind up to the Q&A, but just before we do that, since you've given such a detailed account, it's quite clear that Fakir Azizuddin had nothing really to do with the Jinda. And he was probably gone by the time she came into prominence, because a recent novel has come out on Jinda, I think it's Chitra Divakurdni's novel, in which she uses the technique of Fakir Azizuddin writing elaborate letters to Jinda. So we take it as that is pure fiction.
I'm afraid so. I mean, I don't know whether you've seen this film called The Black Prince.
Yep. Yes, unfortunately, I've seen it, yes.
Yeah, well, what amused me about that was, apart from the fictionality of it, was I asked Shabana Azmi, I said, did you study any of this? And she said, I can't speak Punjabi. And so I had to memorize the lines. And I said, well, you gave a very convincing performance of a lady who, although she could not converse for long anyway, she and Maharaja Dalip Singh, he could speak a smattering of Punjabi, I think, by then. But nevertheless, she managed to undo Rani Jinda in 2 years what it had taken the British 15 years to do. They wanted to make a Christian out of him, a Christian prince. And within 2 years, she unraveled it all and brought him back to his heritage. And I thought it was not just her performance, but I said it was a remarkable achievement by this lady who, right until the end, remained, Well,
it was I think Shabana's performance was the redeeming feature of that film. And I must say that the producer and director had my book very close to them and had underlined it heavily and used it without wanting to acknowledge it.
Yeah.
When I showed Shabana that, she was furious with them in my presence. And she said, why didn't you give me this book before I did the role?
Yeah.
Well, these are the realities of writing and depicting history as fiction and the pitfalls and the dangers. But I am going to have to, unfortunately, I'm getting signals that there are lots of questions. I hope there
Certainly.
are, Arvinder, Ravi. I'll pass you on to them. And then I'd like to thank you personally very much for this lovely conversation, and back to you for the questions. Do we have?
Well, there are a couple. I mean, there are comments. We won't have time, but a couple of questions. But before that, it was partly discussed. I thought I'd ask a question about the spectacular fall, which Ejasa spoke about, and which Navtej has actually written about in the novel based on Dalip Singh's life, The Exile. And it's a pity that Shabana didn't read that novel, because the character of Jinda is just, it's brilliantly done in this book, Exile, which is told from the point of view of four people, Dalip Singh and Jinda also one of them. There were comments, but there are just two questions by Mr. Azam Gill. So the first, well, I'm going to read it the way it is. The first is, how did the Maharaja fall into the clutches of the Dogras? I am unable to unravel the mystery, he says. And the second question, which is actually a comment, he says, the only time the Maharaja was gravely annoyed with Fakir Azizuddin was when the Khalsa army was fully prepared to attack Kabul, but Azizuddin let the Afghans off the hook in a diplomatic move. So either both, those are for you, Ejasa, if you want to take.
Yes, of course. Yeah, certainly. Well, the first is, why was Maharaja Ranjit Singh so dependent upon the Dogras? I think for that you'll have to wait until, or the questioner will have to wait until I produce my next book, which could be on the Dogras, the three Dogras. But for the moment, I'll have to sidestep that, because there is no, they were extremely canny, they were highly intelligent and unscrupulous, as we know from Gulab Singh's behavior. But particularly during the internecine war following Maharaja Khadak Singh's death, when you had on the one side Gulab Singh inside the Lahore fort and Dhyan Singh outside the Lahore fort, one supporting the widow of Naunihal Singh, and on the other side supporting Sher Singh as the claimant. So they played, forgive me using these phrases, they played a dirty game, but it was to their own, they did it to their own personal advantage, and Gulab Singh emerged with Kashmir as a result. I'm not going to I can't discuss the role of the Dogras in this. I think for that you might have to read my book or read Kushwan Singh's book, which is fairly explicit in this and descriptive. But let me come to the second part of the question was relating to
the attack on
the Kabul.
Yeah,
I think the person has got his facts wrong, because in fact Azizuddin never advised against that. What did happen was that when he went over with the troops, he was abducted. He was sent as an emissary, and he was kept as a hostage by those Muhammad. And then he complained, and he said, this is unethical, because it has never happened in the history of diplomacy that you keep the diplomat hostage. And those Muhammad then retired from the fort of Ali Masjid and leaves Azizuddin alone on the road. And from where he is retrieved, he comes back, and then he narrates how those Muhammad had taunted him by saying, how dare you eat the salt of an infidel? You know, as a Muslim, how dare you do this? And so this was another test, like, of Azizuddin's fidelity to the Maharaja. I don't think he ever prevented the Maharaja or the troops from ever attacking the Afghans. No, his loyalties were absolutely clear and singular.
So as I said, the others were, well, there is one more, sorry, just a minute, let me, and this is from Kiranjot Kaur, and the question is, how did the British impact the Punjabi culture of Maharaja's court?
Well, during his lifetime, they didn't, because they only came as visitors, And as I mentioned about following Lord Bentinck's visit in 1831, when you had the field of the cloth of gold, etc., Ropar, after that, there was an equivalence between the East India Company and the Raj, the court at Lahore. So there was no question of them having any kind of influence as far as Punjabi culture was concerned or Punjabi language, etc. Not at all. It was only subsequently, post 1849, when the annexation took place, that the British then exercised their responsibility, or what they thought was their responsibility, for restructuring the Punjab. And then you have this famous argument between Sir Henry Lawrence and his brother Sir John Lawrence, who are members of the Board of Administration, where Henry Lawrence wants to rule through the Sardars. And John Lawrence doesn't, and both, particularly John Lawrence, he spoke Punjabi fluently. So that is when they then begin to reconstruct the edifice of the Punjab, the administrative, educational, judicial, etc. And that was done, but post 1849, not during Maharaja Ranjit Singh's life.
There's a question from Gursham Singh, which I think if both of you could take that, both Ajaz Sahab and Navtej. Navtej, because of your translation, among other things, translation of Zafarnama. So his question is, what can be done or should be done to make available Khalsa Persian sources for future research on this period, or on this subject?
Well, I think it's, honestly, I think it's a great tragedy that something so recent is not available to everybody. You have much older sources, much older, documents available today. But unfortunately, I think, and part of it probably was the reason was the partition, and, that things got divided in different places. But I think it's not impossible. I think somebody needs to take it on. Some government needs to take it on. I believe it was almost being started during the time of the partition or soon thereafter. And then it sort of fell into, it got neglected. So, some of the work like Professor Ganda Singh has done for some of the other work and earlier, and even parts of this, I think for instance, there's this huge book which I used hugely, Professor Ganda Singh's Correspondence of Maharaja Dalip Singh, which simply put it together. It's like an encyclopedia. But similarly, I think a government has to take it on. Probably, ideally, both governments have to take this on, and whether separately or on a good day together, and make this available. And I think the Persian is getting old. And Persian nuances of, the Persian used at that time. For instance, you mentioned the Zafarnama. I know that the Punjab Persian used at that time was very different, not very different, but considerably more different in nuances from what we would expect Persian in Persia. So, similarly, this Persian also, we would still have scholars who would understand it. Maybe a couple of generations later, we won't have anybody. So I think this is the time to do it.
You're absolutely right, Navtej, because both governments, I think and they're acting through their archives, have done the first stage, which is they've begun documenting them and scanning them. So our government on this side of the border, the Punjab government, has initiated a program for scanning the Persian documents. They were catalogued, but they've not translated. And as you rightly point out, the ability of scholars to be able to translate Persian documents knowledgeably, that ability is diminishing. And my fear is that you will have very few scholars who will either have the time or the inclination or the resources to be able to research. So it has to be something which is done, at a governmental level, where they have to allocate an amount and then just make sure that they bring together retired people if necessary, but persons who have the facility to be able to do this and the competence.
So I think Preeti should be Alvinder?
Yeah. Thank
You have one moment.
Yeah.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, just one moment, if you don't mind.
Please,
It'll just take 2 minutes, but I think it's, if you don't mind.
please.
And that is, I quoted, and it's worth saying, and I'm going to kind of sum up the contribution of the brothers. I've said that without reading Machiavelli, Ranjit Singh had understood instinctively, intuitively, that the first opinion that is formed of a ruler's intelligence is based on the quality of the men he has around him. When they are competent and loyal, he can always be considered wise because he's been able to recognize their competence and to keep them loyal. This is Machiavelli writing, and it is applicable, I believe, to Maharaja Ranjit Singh's style of governance. When I was working on another book, and it's called The Imperial Curiosity, and dealt with the visit of Tsar Nicholas II as the Tsarevich, who was the heir apparent, to Lahore. And what I was reading, and I was expecting a sort of account, usual kind of descriptive account of the mosque and the fort, etc. And I came across this. It was in the account that was written by Tomsky, who was the count attending the Tsarevich, and it was published in 1891. The visit took place in January 1891. And he mentions that in these gloomy halls, he's talking about the Sheesh Mahal and the fort. In these gloomy halls, the destinies of the Punjab hung for a short while in the balance. Far-seeing Brahmins and Mohammedans, the favorite counselors of a Sikh sovereign, assisted him to carry out his clever foreign policy. Chief among them was the talented Fakir Azizuddin, a native of Bukhara, where members of his family are said to dwell to the present day. Now here you have in 1891, a Russian crown prince, the Tsarevich, visiting Lahore, and the reputation of Fakir Azizuddin is still lingering in the air. I thought it was a wonderful tribute to the sagacity and the reputation of this man, that so many years after his death, a Russian prince should acknowledge his contribution.
And is there still somebody in Bukhara?
Sorry?
Is there still somebody in Bukhara?
If I have my DNA tested, perhaps, yes. I'm not sure. It must be generations, hundreds of years ago.
So, Raviji, do you have anything else? Yeah, I think probably I sent you another question.
Oh, sorry. This is from Sukhdev Singh, Sukhdev Singh Sohal.
Yeah.
And he asks, do you think the Fakir brothers could have contained the bloodshed, bloodshed, I'm presuming, that followed the death of Ranjit Singh, could have contained the bloodshed had they wanted to do so?
Well, I'm reminded of the remark that Stalin made about the Pope when somebody questioned his attitude towards the Jews and towards the programs that he was implementing. And they said, the Pope will not agree. The Pope will not take a good view of this. And Stalin looked at this person and he said, and how many legions does the Pope have? Now, the same thing is true, I think, of the Fakir brothers. How many troops did they have to be able to quell the Sikh Khalsa as it was at the time? They preferred, and I think sensibly, they preferred to withdraw within themselves, realizing that they couldn't influence what was by this time, a rabid mob that was determined on self-destruction and determined upon taking the British. And as I quoted in the earlier remark, where Fakir Azizuddin tells Maharaja Conrad Nonihal, saying that, look, I've spent 30 years of my life bringing about a bridge between the British and the Darbar. And why should, best advice I can give you is don't do this, don't do it.
Right. Thank you so very much, sir. It was indeed an honor to have two stalwarts in this beautiful session, Natej and Ijaz. A beautiful, deep insight into the life of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, for the human relationships. And, there was no execution during his regime, during his life. So he never took a life outside his battle. And one of our participants, reads out like that: "Heart bleeds to read the events after the Maharaja's death. The whole empire fell like cards." But yes, that's the story. That's the truth. That's a fact. But sir, Maja House ਦੇ ਇਸ ਵਿਹੜੇ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਦਿਲ ਦੀਆਂ ਗਹਿਰਾਈਆਂ ਤੋਂ ਸ਼ੁਕਰੀਆ, ਧੰਨਵਾਦ। Navtej ji, ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਧੰਨਵਾਦ। Ravi ji, for bringing these two beautiful souls on this platform. And thanks to the audience for making this. And we are humbly honored. And we would like to have another session on your upcoming book with, again, Navtej ji as a moderator. Thank you so very much, and wonderful session. Sare participants ne enu inna enjoy kita. Inna, if I read out the compliments, it'll take about 30 minutes more to me, to read out those compliments in the chat box. Thank you once again, and thank you so very much. Charda Jinda.
Thanks, Arvinder. I just want, just quickly, I just wanted to say, and that's wonderful. I also wanted actually at some point, to request both of you, for another session whenever you're free, because this really, I knew this would be fantastic, and it was. And I've actually also been talking to Preeti about at some point doing a session on the Zafarnama, which I think would be brilliant. And also your next book, Ejaz Saab. So I heard that, I've noted that.
Okay.
So thank you very much to both of you. And Preeti wanted me to mention everybody who's part of the audience. Just wanted to remind you of a session on the 30th of January when Rajmohan Gandhi, they will be speaking. It will be the last session of the Syal Festival, and he will be speaking on belonging and unbelonging, reflections on our history and nationhood. Should be a fascinating session, so hope you'll join. And thanks again very much to both of you.
Thank you so very much, sir. We have wishes and regards for all of you from Washington, D.C. That's from Mr. Khalid. And,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right, sir. Allah Hafiz, Khuda Hafiz, Sat Shri Akal, and Shabba Khair. Good night.
Thank you, Navtej.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Preeti, and thank you.
Bye-bye.
Allah Hafiz.